It had been months since I last felt the warmth of another voice lingering in my room after dusk. My days blurred together in the same quiet rhythm, rising before dawn, working long hours at the workshop, returning home to an empty room, eating in silence while the city hummed faintly beyond the window. Loneliness over time had become less of a feeling and more of a constant companion, invisible but always there. It wasn't loud or cruel, it simply existed like air. Sometimes I would sit outside my small apartment at night, watching couples walk past the narrow street, fingers intertwined, laughter soft against the dark. I would smile at them, though my chest always ached in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't jealous, just yearning. There's a difference. Jealousy wants what others have. Yearning just hopes to be seen even once. Every evening after work, I went to the local market. It was the one place that still felt alive, where the smell of grilled corn mixed with fish sauce, where voices rose and fell like waves. The market had a heartbeat of its own, and I liked walking through it, pretending for a while that I was part of something larger than my quiet life. I often bought small things I didn't need, fruit, tea leaves, sometimes just a loaf of bread, as an excuse to linger there a little longer. That day the sun was low and the heat still clung to the dust when I noticed him. He sat beside a broken cart near the corner stall. A foreigner, maybe mid-20s. His clothes smudged with dirt and his hair damp with sweat. An American, I guessed, from the color of his hair, the faint freckles across his nose. He looked lost in a way that went beyond geography. Not just a traveler unsure of directions, but someone adrift in life itself. I slowed my steps without meaning to. There was something about him that caught me, not in the way a stranger's beauty might catch the eye, but in how fragile he seemed, how out of place he looked among the noise of the market. His eyes, pale, tired, lifted for a second, and for that heartbeat he looked straight at me. Something stirred. Maybe pity. Maybe something softer, something I hadn't felt in years. I hesitated before walking closer. "Are you all right?" I asked, unsure if he would understand me. He blinked, then smiled, faintly the kind of smile that looks borrowed, as if he'd forgotten how to do it naturally. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said in hesitant English, though his voice trembled with exhaustion. "Just bad luck with this cart." The wheel beside him had split. He was trying to fix it with a stick and a fraying rope. I crouched down, gestured toward the broken joint, and said, "Wait, I can help." He watched silently as I adjusted the axle, tied it tighter, and used a small nail from my pocket, a habit from my workshop days. When it held firm, I stood and brushed the dust off my hands. He looked up at me, eyes widening a little as if he hadn't expected kindness. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice was gentle, too gentle for the rough noise around us. I nodded. "You work here?" He nodded back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Just for a while. I help with deliveries. Not much, but..." He shrugged as if the rest didn't matter. There was nothing else to say. I offered him a small smile before walking away, but for the rest of the evening his face lingered in my mind. The quiet gratitude, the weary calm, the way his voice had sounded when he said thank you. It wasn't just politeness. It felt like the sound of someone remembering what kindness felt like. That night I sat by my window, staring out at the market lights fading in the distance. Somewhere in that crowd was a young man I barely knew, yet he'd made my heart stir in ways I didn't think were possible anymore. It was strange, how quickly a stranger's presence could feel familiar, as if loneliness itself had shifted its shape and taken a human form, one with soft eyes and a broken cart. I didn't plan to see him again, but part of me knew I would. Something inside had already begun to reach toward him, a quiet pull, gentle but certain, like the tide moving toward the shore, inevitable and unseen. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The air outside was still heavy with dawn mist, the market stalls just beginning to stir awake. I told myself I needed vegetables for dinner, though my kitchen shelves were already full. It wasn't the vegetables I was after, and I knew it. When I reached the corner stall, I saw him again, the American boy from the day before. His cart stood fixed now, steady on its new wheel, and he was laughing with the old woman who sold spices nearby. The sound caught me off guard. It wasn't loud, just light, like a note of music carried by the wind. He noticed me standing there and lifted a hand in greeting. "Hey, you again?" His voice carried a teasing warmth that made something flutter inside me. I smiled, awkwardly tucking my hands into my pockets. Yes, I needed rice, I lied. He laughed again, brushing a bit of dust off his sleeve. That's a good reason to come back. I bought a small bag of rice I didn't need and lingered, asking how his work was going. He told me deliveries were slow, the pay wasn't great, but the people were kind. His Vietnamese was clumsy, but he tried, and that effort, that quiet humility, made me like him even more. After that morning, I began finding excuses to visit the market every day. Sometimes I'd say I needed fresh herbs. Other times I'd claim I'd run out of salt or tea. I told myself it was habit, but it wasn't. It was him. The boy with the sun-worn hair and the eyes that always looked a little lost, a little hopeful. We started talking more. At first it was small things. The weather, food, how loud the market could be. Then, slowly, our conversation stretched longer. He told me his name was Eli. He'd come to Vietnam a few months ago hoping to teach English, but things hadn't gone as planned. His papers got delayed, the school never followed through, and his savings had run out. He'd been doing odd jobs since, carrying crates, cleaning stalls, helping vendors. When he spoke, I could hear the fatigue beneath his words. He wasn't just surviving. He was trying not to lose faith. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how to offer it without sounding pitying. So instead I listened. Maybe that was enough. To listen, to remember, to show up every day without needing a reason. Sometimes when the afternoon heat grew unbearable, I'd buy 2 cold drinks and hand him one without a word. He'd take it with a grin, always saying, "You know, you don't have to keep saving me from dehydration." "I'm just saving myself from guilt," I'd answer, pretending not to look at him too long. He laughed easily, and with each day, I found myself memorizing the small things about him. The way he pushed his hair back when he thought. The way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted heavy boxes. The quiet way he thanked people. There were pauses between our words sometimes. Long, unspoken silences where something else seemed to hover. Not awkwardness, but awareness. As if both of us were standing near a line we hadn't decided whether to cross. One afternoon, rain began to fall unexpectedly, scattering the market in minutes. Vendors rushed to cover their stalls. People ran for shelter, and the air filled with the smell of wet earth. I found myself beside his cart again, both of us ducking under the same plastic awning. He looked at me, water dripping from his hair. "Guess you'll have to buy something again," he joked. "I already have everything," I said quietly. He smiled, a soft, genuine one this time, the kind that warms the chest rather than burns it. "Then maybe you're just here for the view." I wanted to laugh, but the way he said it made my throat tighten. For a moment, all the noise of the market seemed far away, just the two of us breathing the same humid air, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his shoulder near mine. When the rain finally stopped, we stepped out together. The ground glistened with puddles, reflecting pieces of sky. I offered to walk him part of the way, and he didn't refuse. We talked about little things, how different our hometowns were, what foods we missed, what music we liked. "Sometimes," he said as we reached the road, "I think people aren't meant to stay still too long. The world feels smaller when you do." I nodded, understanding him in ways I couldn't put into words. "And yet," I said, "sometimes the smallest places hide the biggest peace." He looked at me, thoughtful. Maybe that's why I haven't left yet. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of rain still echoed in my mind, along with the look in his eyes when he said that. I didn't know what it meant, maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I knew that the next morning, I would go to the market again. Days blurred into weeks. We built a rhythm without realizing it. He'd see me coming and wave before I even reached his stall. Sometimes he'd tease me, running out of rice again, and I'd smile, pretending to be embarrassed. We began sharing lunch breaks, sitting on overturned crates, watching the crowd flow past like a river. He told me stories about his hometown, open fields, wide roads, snow in winter. I told him about the sea near my village, how the wind there always smelled of salt and home. Between us grew something light, unspoken, but alive. One afternoon, when the sky burned gold before sunset, he reached into his pocket and held out a small trinket, a thin bracelet made of twine and 2 tiny shells. "I made it yesterday," he said shyly. "You helped me more than you know." I looked at it, then at him. "It's beautiful." Then it's yours. I slipped it onto my wrist, feeling the rough edges of the shells against my skin. Thank you, I said softly. He smiled, and for a fleeting second, the world around us seemed to fade, and the noise, the dust, everything, leaving only the two of us standing there, caught between friendship and something deeper neither dared to name. That night, as I sat by my window, the bracelet glimmered faintly in the lamplight. I turned it between my fingers and thought of him. Of his laughter, his quiet eyes, and how each day the market had become less of a place to visit and more of a reason to wake up. The morning he told me he was leaving, the air felt heavier than usual, like the sky itself was waiting to fall. I had gone to the market the way I always did, carrying the same half-made excuse in my head. But when I reached his stall, the cart was half empty, and he was folding crates into neat stacks, his movements slow, distracted. "You're early," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's my last day here." The words didn't make sense at first. "Last day?" I repeated, stepping closer. "Why?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "The job was only temporary. The guy I was helping found someone else. Someone local, cheaper." He laughed softly, but it was the kind of laugh that hides defeat. "Guess I've been fired by the economy." I stared at him, the world narrowing to the sound of that word. Fired. I didn't know what to say. I'd never thought about what it would feel like not to see him every day. But in that moment, the thought left an ache I couldn't swallow. "What will you do now?" I asked quietly. He shrugged, eyes on the ground. "Find another odd job, I guess. Maybe in the next town. Maybe further north. I'll figure it out." The thought of him leaving, of the market without his laughter, the afternoons without our shared drinks, the small bracelet now meaningless on my wrist, filled me with something that felt a lot like panic. I hesitated for a moment, then said, "Come by my workplace tomorrow. There might be something you can do." He blinked, surprised. "Your workplace?" I nodded. "A small repair shop near the main road. We fix engines, bikes, small machines. The owner's been talking about needing help." I could talk to him. For a moment, he just stared at me as if unsure whether to believe it. Then slowly his face softened. "You'd do that for me?" "I'd do that for a friend," I said, though the word friend felt too small for what I meant. He smiled then, that real smile of his, the one that crinkled his eyes and made my heart unsteady. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "I don't know what I'd do without you right now." That night I spoke to my boss, Mr. Hean, a quiet man who valued reliability more than words. He frowned at first when I explained, but eventually nodded. "If he works hard, he can start next week," he said simply. When I told Eli, his relief was so visible it almost hurt to watch. He grabbed my hands without thinking, his eyes bright with gratitude. "You really did this?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. I nodded, feeling warmth creep up my neck. "You needed a job." He looked down at our hands still touching, then let go, whispering, "I owe you everything." "You owe me dinner," I said, half joking, half not. And he laughed, not the tired kind this time, but something lighter. "Deal." Eli started at the shop that Monday. At first, the other workers were skeptical. A foreigner in a repair shop wasn't something they saw every day. But he learned quickly, followed instructions carefully, and his gentle nature soon won them over. I watched him from across the workshop sometimes, his shirt rolled up to his elbows, his hair messy, his concentration deep. There was something quietly beautiful about seeing him fit into my world piece by piece. We began sharing meals after work, sitting on low stools outside a noodle stand, steam curling between us. He always insisted on paying when he could, though I knew his savings were still thin. I didn't argue. I just wanted him there. At night, we'd sometimes walk back together, our paths half lit by street lamps. The conversation stretched longer, about dreams, fears, what it meant to start over. He told me about the pressure back home, about not fitting into the life his family wanted for him. "Here I feel like I can breathe," he said once, eyes following the movement of motorbikes down the road. "Back there I always felt like I was living someone else's plan." I didn't tell him, but I understood too well. I'd spent years doing what was expected, working, surviving, never asking for more. But now, standing beside him, I wanted more. Soon people began to notice our closeness, The old lady who sold us coffee would tease. You two are always together. Are you brothers or something better? We'd laugh it off, but I could feel my heart tighten every time someone said it. He didn't seem to care. If anything, he became more at ease. Sometimes he'd nudge my shoulder when we walked or toss me the wrench at work with a grin. Little things, small and meaningless to anyone else, but to me they were everything. One evening it rained again, heavy and sudden, the kind of rain that soaks you in seconds. We were just locking up the shop when it started, and neither of us had an umbrella. We ran under the small metal awning near the gate, breathless and laughing. Guess the sky doesn't like letting us go home dry, he said, shaking his hair like a dog. I smiled, watching droplets cling to his eyelashes. Maybe it wants us to stay a little longer. He looked at me then, really looked. And for a heartbeat, the space between us felt charged, alive with something neither of us could name. Do you ever think, he began softly, that some people are meant to find each other in the strangest places? I swallowed, my voice barely a whisper. All the time. The rain grew louder, blurring the sound of our words. He shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine, warmth cutting through the chill. We stood there in silence, sharing the small shelter, sharing the moment. When the rain finally eased, we walked home together. On the way, he stopped by a small stall and bought 2 bowls of soup, hot, simple, fragrant with lemongrass. We sat on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight, sharing it quietly. He glanced at me, his voice low. You know, I think you've saved me twice now. I stirred the soup with my spoon. I just helped. You did the rest. He smiled faintly, eyes soft. Maybe, but I don't think I've ever felt this safe before. The rain began again, softer this time, more a whisper than a storm. We didn't move. Just sat there, side by side, steam rising between us, the city breathing around us. That night, as I watched him laugh at something small, a noodle slipping from his chopsticks, I realized that somewhere between helping him fix a cart and finding him a job, I had found something I hadn't even known I was searching for, not just companionship, not even love, not yet, but the beginning of it, the quiet promise of something that might finally last. When Eli told me his landlord was raising the rent, he tried to sound casual about it, but his voice faltered halfway through the sentence. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air felt heavy with the smell of rain but didn't quite let it fall. We were sitting outside the repair shop, both too tired to move, sipping cheap bottled tea. I'll probably have to find another place, he said, avoiding my eyes. Something smaller. Or maybe outside the city. I didn't answer right away. The thought of him packing up his few belongings, leaving behind the sound of his laughter in the workshop, the small routines we'd built, it made something twist deep inside my chest. Where will you go? I asked finally. He shrugged. Not sure. I can't afford much, not on what I make. He tried to smile, but it didn't stay. I looked down at the empty bottle in my hand, turning it between my palms. The words came before I could think too much about them. You could stay with me. He blinked, startled. With you? I have a small room. It's not much, but there's space for 2. For a long second, he said nothing. Then slowly his lips curved into that soft, hesitant smile I'd learned to recognize, the one that came from surprise and gratitude tangled together. You sure? I nodded, trying to keep my tone even. It'd be better than sleeping on the floor somewhere else. He exhaled, and in that sound was all the relief he'd been holding back. Then, okay, I'll stay. Moving in together didn't feel like a grand change. It felt like breathing a little easier. He arrived with 2 small bags and a handful of clothes. The room suddenly looked less lonely with his things scattered across it. A folded shirt draped over the chair, a toothbrush by the sink, a faint scent of foreign soap mixing with the smell of coffee. At first, we were careful with each other, stepping around quietly, pretending not to notice the small adjustments. But soon a rhythm began to form. He woke earlier than I did, humming softly while boiling water for tea. I'd come out half awake to see him leaning by the window, sunlight warming his face. Sometimes he'd make breakfast, sometimes I would. The meals were simple, rice, eggs, vegetables, but somehow they always tasted better when eaten together. In the evenings we cooked side by side, the air thick with steam and laughter. He wasn't very good with Vietnamese spices, often mixing too much or too little, but I didn't mind. Watching him try, tongue peeking out in concentration, cheeks dusted with flour, was its own kind of joy. Once, while washing dishes, we both reached for the same bowl, and our hands brushed. The moment was so brief it should have passed unnoticed, but it didn't. He froze for a heartbeat, glanced at me, then smiled, a quiet, almost secret smile. I turned away before he could see mine. Nights were my favorite part. We had only one bed, so he laid out a blanket on the floor at first. But after a few nights of hearing him toss and shift, I insisted he take the bed. "It's fine," he argued.
"You're the one who—" "Eli," I interrupted gently.
"It's my bed. If anyone's sleeping on it, it should be you." He looked at me for a long time, then sighed. "Fine, but only if you share it." I tried to laugh it off, but he wasn't joking. So that night and every night after, we lay side by side in the narrow bed, careful at first not to cross the invisible line between us. But as the nights stretched on, that line blurred. I'd wake sometimes to the sound of his breathing, slow and steady, his arm just inches from mine. There was comfort in that sound, in the warmth of another body close enough to remind me I wasn't alone anymore. One night, unable to sleep, I whispered, "You ever get tired of running?" He was quiet for a while. Then in the dark, his voice came soft. "All the time. But I don't know how to stop." "Maybe stopping doesn't mean giving up," I said. "Maybe it just means finding a place that feels like home." He turned his head toward me. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze in the dark. And what if that place isn't a place? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. Over the weeks, we shared more pieces of ourselves. One evening, as we sat on the floor eating dinner, I told him about my childhood, how I grew up in a small fishing village where people knew each other's names but rarely their hearts, how I'd moved to the city hoping to be someone, only to end up invisible again. He listened, his eyes soft, the way someone listens when they understand more than they say. I always felt like the background, I admitted, like I was part of the scenery but never the story. He put down his bowl. "You're wrong," he said gently. "You just needed someone to notice the story already there." I looked at him, unsure what to say. He didn't look away. Later, he shared his own pieces. The father who wanted him to inherit a business he hated. The mother who never said much but always looked sad. The expectations that felt like chains. "Coming here was supposed to be a year of freedom," he said quietly. "Now I'm scared of what happens when it ends." "Maybe it doesn't have to end," I said. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "Maybe not." Life, in its quiet way, began to feel full. We built small rituals, late-night walks after work, sharing stories over cheap coffee, teasing each other about who forgot to buy soap again. The simplicity of it all was grounding. He'd sometimes leave notes for me on the counter, small sketches or jokes, and I'd pretend to scold him for wasting paper. The world outside went on, indifferent, but within our little room, everything slowed down. There was laughter, there was warmth, and in between the ordinary moments, there was something deeper, an understanding that didn't need words. One evening, after a long day, I came home to find him sitting by the window, guitar in hand. I didn't know he played. His voice was low, unpolished, but sincere. He sang a few lines of a song I didn't recognize, the melody soft and broken in places. When he finished, I asked, "What's it about?" He smiled without turning. "Home." And then he looked at me, his expression open, unguarded. "You make it feel like one." The words hung between us, too heavy and too fragile to touch. I felt something shift quietly inside me, like a tide moving beneath calm water. That night the room was silent except for the rain tapping against the window. I turned to him as we lay side by side, our shoulders touching just enough to feel the warmth through thin fabric. He didn't say anything, but his hand brushed against mine. Deliberate this time. We didn't speak, didn't move, just let the silence wrap around us like something sacred. When I turned to look at him, he met my eyes, and for a long moment we just stayed like that, breathing, understanding. That night he didn't thank me. He just looked at me, and somehow that was enough. At first it was only glances, a few too long stares from the neighbors when we stepped out together in the morning. The woman at the tea stall pausing mid-sentence when Eli reached for the sugar jar I'd already touched. The landlord's wife, who used to greet us warmly, now only nodded, eyes sharp, lips pressed thin. I told myself it was nothing. People in this part of town always had opinions to fill their days. But whispers travel fast in narrow alleys, and soon even the walls seemed to listen. At the repair shop, I started to notice the small changes. A coworker who used to joke with me suddenly fell quiet when Eli walked in. Another nudged his friend, smirking when we sat together at lunch. One afternoon, as we were closing the shop, I overheard two of them muttering near the door. "Foreigners are strange," one said. "You never know what they want." The other laughed softly. "Maybe he already found what he wants." Their words stung more than I expected. I didn't say anything to Eli. He'd had enough judgment in his life already, but I could feel the weight of those whispers pressing against my chest. That night, while we were eating, I was quieter than usual. Eli noticed, of course. He always did. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, pushing my bowl aside. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, then leaned back. "It's not just tired, is it?" I didn't answer. The sound of rain outside filled the silence between us. Finally, I said, "People are talking." He tilted his head slightly. "About what?" I gave a small, bitter laugh. "About us." He was quiet for a long time, then said softly, "Does it bother you?" I hesitated. "It bothers me that it might hurt you." He smiled then, faint but sure. "Let them talk." Eli, he reached across the table, brushing his fingers against mine. His hand was warm, steady. "You know what I used to do back home when people talked about me?" I shook my head. "I'd run," he said. "Leave before they could push me away. But here," he looked around the small, dimly lit room, the kettle on the stove, the rain dripping through the window frame, the quiet safety we'd built. "Here's the first place I've ever stayed long enough to want to fight for it." The way he said it made my throat tighten. I wanted to believe it was that simple, but I knew the way people looked at us, the way silence can turn cruel. Still, when he smiled, everything in me softened. "I don't care what they think," he said. "As long as I have you." Days passed. The gossip didn't stop, but I learned to move through it like smoke, present but no longer choking me. We still walked to the market together every morning, shoulders close, sometimes laughing too loud just to remind ourselves that joy was still ours to claim. At the shop, when coworkers stared, I smiled back now, steady, unashamed. When neighbors whispered, Eli would sometimes take my hand as we passed, a quiet rebellion disguised as affection. One evening, the landlord's wife caught me in the courtyard. "You're a good man," she said cautiously. "Don't let that foreigner ruin your name." I met her eyes, calm but firm. "He hasn't ruined anything," I said. "He gave me peace." She blinked, unsure what to say, then turned away. I didn't feel anger, only a strange kind of pity. Some people live their whole lives without ever touching something true. One night, as we sat by the window, the city's lights flickering like distant fireflies, Eli spoke again. "Do you ever wish things were easier?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But easy things don't usually mean much." He smiled. "Yeah, maybe love isn't supposed to be easy." I looked at him then, at the way his hair fell into his eyes, the faint shadow of tiredness on his face, the warmth that always seemed to find me when I least expected it. "Maybe not," I said, "but it's supposed to be real." He reached for my hand again, lacing our fingers together. Outside the city murmured cars, laughter, rain, but here inside our tiny room, it was just us. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide the way I looked at him. After that, life settled into something quiet but strong. The world outside could talk, stare, misunderstand, but it no longer held power over us. We cooked together, argued about little things, shared the bed without hesitation. Some nights he'd fall asleep first, his hand resting against my arm, and I'd watch him in the half-dark, realizing how strange it was to feel so at peace while the rest of the world refused to understand. Love, I learned, didn't need witnesses. It only needed truth, and as long as we had that, the world could keep its noise. We would live quietly but proudly, because what we had was ours, and that was enough. It had been 6 months since the night the rain washed away the last of our fears. 6 months of quiet mornings, gentle laughter, and the sound of a foreign voice slowly learning to say my name the way I liked it, softly, as if it meant something sacred. The world outside hadn't changed much. The same neighbors still whispered, the same streets still buzzed with life. But inside our small quarter, time moved differently. It wasn't measured in hours or days, but in tiny, precious moments. The smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight filtering through thin curtains, the way Eli hummed under his breath when he cooked. We had built something of our own now, a small life, humble but full. Behind our room, we cleared a little patch of land where weeds once grew wild. Together, we turned it into a garden. At first, nothing would grow. The soil was stubborn, dry, but Eli, patient as ever, kept tending to it every morning, kneeling in the dirt. His hands gentle on the roots. "It just needs time," he'd say, smiling at the tiny shoots breaking through. I used to think love was something grand. A fire, a storm, something that would arrive with thunder and take your breath away. But now, watching him crouched over a row of basil and mint, I realized love was something else entirely. It was the quiet persistence of sunlight, the calm after rain, the warmth of two hands brushing against each other by accident and not pulling away. Our days had found their rhythm. I'd wake first listening to the slow sound of his breathing beside me. The dawn light would creep across the floor, painting the room in soft gold. I'd make coffee, its scent filling the air, and sometimes when he stirred awake, he'd mumble in broken Vietnamese, half asleep. "Chao boi sang." "Good morning." His accent was terrible, and I loved it. Sometimes he'd grin proudly after saying it right, and I'd tease him, "Almost perfect this time." He'd laugh and reply, "Almost means progress." We shared our mornings like a ritual, 2 cups, one small table, a slice of bread, and whatever fruits were fresh that week. We didn't talk much during breakfast. We didn't have to. The silence between us had turned into something beautiful, not empty, but full of knowing. Eli had found his place at the workshop, too. At first, the others had kept their distance, unsure of him, but his easy kindness had a way of softening even the hardest hearts. Soon they began to laugh with him, borrow his tools, share cigarettes during breaks. He never talked about the past anymore, the uncertainty, the running. He didn't need to. His eyes told me he'd finally stopped searching. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, he said quietly, "You know, I used to think home was a place. Now I think it's just a feeling. One I'd never found before you." I looked at him and something in my chest ached, not with sadness, but with fullness. "Then stay," I said simply. He smiled, leaned his head against my shoulder. "I already am." The garden flourished slowly, stubbornly, like us. We planted lemongrass, chili, coriander. Sometimes Eli would hold up a tiny sprig and grin like a child. "We did it," he'd say, as if growing life from dirt was magic. Maybe it was. Rain came often that season, soft and unhurried. The sound of it against the tin roof was like music, and on those days we'd sit by the window with cups of tea, talking about everything and nothing. He'd ask me about my childhood, my family, my dreams. I didn't have many answers, but he never minded. "I don't need stories," he said once, "just moments," and we had plenty of those. One morning, after a night of steady rain, I woke to find him already outside, barefoot in the wet grass. The garden sparkled under the new light, droplets clinging to every leaf. He turned when he heard me, his hair damp, his smile brighter than the sun itself. "Come see," he called. I stepped outside, the air cool and sweet. Together we stood in silence, watching the sunrise spill gold over the rooftops. The world felt clean again, reborn. Eli reached out, his fingers brushing mine. I didn't pull away. I never did anymore. "You know," I said quietly, "I once thought love would come loudly, with fireworks, with big moments. But it didn't." He turned to me, eyes soft. "How did it come then?" I smiled, watching the light touch his face. "It came softly, with the scent of rain and coffee." He laughed, then leaned his head against mine. For a long while, we said nothing. There was no need to. The birds sang somewhere in the distance, the city began to wake, and in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, and peace. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that grows from being understood. Sometimes I still think about the first day I saw him, the tired boy by the broken cart, the stranger who smiled through dust and heat. I didn't know then how deeply he would root himself in my life, how the ache of loneliness I once carried like a second skin would fade, replaced by something warmer, quieter, more alive. Now, when I look around and at the small garden, the chipped cups, the 2 towels drying side by side, I realize I no longer feel like a man waiting for life to begin. It already has. Eli stands beside me humming softly, the early light painting his face gold. The air smells of wet earth and mint, and I think in a world that once felt too wide for one heart, I finally found the one that beats beside mine, quietly, endlessly, and enough.